Okay, I want to show you where this PowerPoint is going to be. You have to click the PowerPoint content where you can go to review this. Then you click Post Midterm PowerPoints. You have to probably click it twice. And then, of course, you're going to click the Progressive Presidents here, which will open up in a new scene. I'm going to give you a short introduction here into presidential progressivism. Because up until this point, we've only seen progressivism at the local level. We haven't seen it at the federal level. It's been mostly at state levels and local levels where people are more active. But you don't see this at the federal level yet, but you're going to. And a lot of this is happening at the time that the United States is becoming a major power. You see the rise of the U.S. as a nation state. You also start to see the nationalization in American life. This is occurring throughout the entire country, due to things like the development of national corporations, which were far-reaching. Might work for a company in Pennsylvania that might have far-reaching implications. You also start to see the rise of the professions, the professional areas as well. The professional organizations, not just academics, but also things like the American Medical Association, the AMA. Medicine is becoming more and more a major topic. At the same time, you're starting to also see that this is also, of course, to raise incomes, of course, but the other thing, you start to see the development of things like the American Bar Association, the American Political Science Association, the American Historical Association, the American Sociological Association, etc. These are the major professional organizations. And what they're there for is to sort of establish standards of professionalism and sort of ethics, some kind of universal recognition. And in this sense too, we start to see this sort of nationalization. If you were part of the AMA, it didn't matter. It certainly had a lot more respect because you were a doctor, and it didn't matter where you were a doctor. If you remember the AMA, it kind of made sense. But we also see that this is also reflects the standard that America has in the development of the National and American baseball leagues as well. We start to see local ball teams start to become more nationalized at this time. And you start to see, especially with the more and more inventions, you'll see the development of the evening ball games, especially in places like New York, where you can get electric light at night now. And you start to see a recognition of people. We all know who the New York Yankees are, etc. I'm not a fan of any particular one. I'm just mentioning this. And in the 1903, of course, we had one of the very first World Series. And of course, this becomes quite, not just entertainment-wise, but it becomes quite a social event as well. We also see that people, more and more of various classes, middle class, lower classes, various groups, understand that only an energetic national government can really create the social circumstances for freedom. That the national corporation, the industrialization of life, and the results of that was taking away some of that freedom that people had. And as a result, you needed government to counteract that. You see this at many times in places throughout this period. And that despite a lot of this, a lot of social policy that was occurring on at the state and federal levels, we start to also see that the view of localism, local control, and local issues is seen as an impediment to national purpose and progress. So it becomes quite different. And why are we doing this? Well, we see a lot of things. In the early 20th century, we see the development of poverty, more poverty, especially in cities. Remember, progressivism starts out as a focus on the city mostly. And we start to see the rise of economic insecurity and the lack of industrial democracy. Remember, when we look at some of the strikes and some of the major union aspects that we've talked about, these people were trying to get more freedom in the workplace, along with better pay and better working conditions. So what you see is kind of an interesting observation that kind of becomes the theme of progressivism here. And that, Herbert Croly would write as the editor of the New Republic, he would say, to achieve Jeffersonian ends of democratic self-determination and individual freedom, the country needed to employ Hamiltonian means of government intervention in the economy. So in order, because remember, well, we didn't talk about this because this would be another class, but Thomas Jefferson believed in that individualistic aspect of life on the farm, and as a country of these small producers. And of course, as the 19th century progresses and into the 20th century, that's completely changed. And in order to maintain that individual freedom, which people were losing, the country, for many people, said, okay, we need to have the government to actually come in and intervene. And each of the presidents that followed in the 20th century, beginning, and this is where we can really truly say that, beginning in the 20th century, we can say, oh, forget this. Sorry, guys. We can truly say that each of the progressive presidents would attempt to address this challenge in their own way. And they all did a very good, all had a different way of doing that. The first one to do this, of course, was Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was an accidental president. He became president, like a lot of people, at least 6 other times, from the fact that the person that was in office at the time died either by assassination or just natural causes. And so by this time, of course, we'd had, William Henry Harrison, who had died. We had Lincoln. We had James Garfield, and then, of course, now William McKinley. So we'd had 4 presidents by this time who had died in office. And McKinley, had chosen Theodore Roosevelt, mostly because Theodore Roosevelt was the only war hero from the Spanish-American War, but he was also a very good campaigner, and it was totally by accident. Theodore Roosevelt came back from the Spanish-American War, and he had managed to become the governor of the state of New York. And as a result, he was making waves, literally, in New York as governor, very, very progressive. So much so that the Republican political machine didn't want him there anymore. Mark Hanna, who had been the campaign manager for William McKinley, decided that, he wanted to get, quote, he wanted that, quote, that cowboy out of the governor's office and out of New York, because, of course, he wanted to control it. And so the best way to do that would be to promote him. And so eventually he got on the vice presidential ticket, and he toured the country. Theodore Roosevelt, I think part of the reason that McKinley did so well in his reelection was because Theodore Roosevelt was out there campaigning. Remember, William Jennings Bryan had sort of broke the mold for presidential campaigns in 1896 by actually actively campaigning. And Theodore Roosevelt took that same step and would do so as well. But now, as vice president, there's not much you can do as vice president. There is no constitutional role for the vice president. He's to preside over the Senate. That's about it. But on September 5th, 1901, Leon Czolgosz decided that there would be a major issue. And the biggest issue, of course, was as I would say, the biggest issue was, of course, what was Roosevelt going to do? So when McKinley was shot, it wasn't. I mean, he didn't die right away. It probably would have been better if he had died right away. He didn't actually die from the gunshot wound. He died from the infection that came thereafter. And it took him, what's worse is it took him 10 days to die. This is also in late September. And so, Vice President Roosevelt is in his cabin up in Tawanis, north of Albany. So as a result, we start to see that, a flurry of telegrams go back and forth at this time. But it took quite something, and I want to kind of describe the situation and how this happened. Saturday, September 14th. Theodore Roosevelt became President of the United States without knowing it. At 2:15 in the morning of September 14th, 1901, he was bouncing in a buckboard down the rain-swept slopes of Mount Marcy in the Adirondacks. Constitutionally, not so much as a heartbeat impeded the flow of power from his assassinated predecessor to himself. I mean, Practically more than 400 miles of mud and rails still separated him from William McKinley's death chamber in Buffalo, where preparations for an emergency inauguration were already underway. For all Roosevelt knew, he was still vice president. Yet he had already realized that he would soon assume the supreme responsibility. Yesterday's telegrams had been relayed up the mountain by telephone operators, riders, and runners, and had documented the spread of gangrene throughout his bullet-ridden body. The last telegram on that day read, "The president is critically ill. His condition is grave. Oxygen is being given. Absolutely no hope." The last telegram to reach Roosevelt's vacation lodge in Upper Tawas had been urgent enough to banish all thought of waiting for clearer weather. It was raining, and he had to go down the side of a mountain. So the president, the last telegram read, "The president appears to be dying, and members of the cabinet in Buffalo think you should lose no time in coming." So that's, the definite clearness of it. So shortly before midnight, as he kissed his wife and children goodbye and began the descent to North Creek Station, at least a 7-hour drive, even by day, he was now at the moment of his ascension. Halfway through the second stage of his journey, some 5 miles north of Adirondack Lodge, where a new wagon and fresh horses awaited him, he sat alone on the passenger seat, shrouded against splashes of mud in a borrowed raincoat several sizes too large. His favorite hat, a broad-brimmed slouch pulled over his ears, kept some of the drizzling rain off his spectacles. Not that one could he see anything beyond the buckboard's circling of lamplight anyway, nor had he much to say since leaving Lower Tawas. Indeed, he spoke hardly a word to the lanky youth in front of him. From time to time, he muttered to himself. Sincere, if slightly grieved for McKinley, a cold-blooded politician he had never much cared for, struggled in Roosevelt's breast, with more violent eruptions and emotions regarding the assassin, Leon Czolgosz. In his opinion, those bullets at Buffalo had been fired not merely at a man, but at the very heart of the American Republic. They were an assault upon representative government and a civilized leader. Unable to contain his rage, he leaned forward and blurted an excoriation of Czolgosz into the rain. "If it had been I who had been shot, he wouldn't have gotten away so easily. I'd have guzzled him first." True. Meanwhile, back in Washington, Secretary of State John Hay sat alone, weeping For hours he had heard newsboys shrieking outside his library window, "Extra! Extra! All about the president dying!" Aging and increasingly hypochondriacal, oh God, Lord, and increasingly a hypochondriac, Hay had worked for and was the personal secretary for Abraham Lincoln and James Garfield, and had seen them both assassinated. This was his third assassination, compounded by the recent death of his own son, but enough to extinguish all desire to go on living in an alien century. But duty had to be done. And so when the final knell sounded across 26th Street, he wrote a telegram officially informing Theodore Roosevelt that McKinley was dead, and he ordered it sent to North Creek Station. At about 3:30 in the morning, the lights of Aden Lodge appeared in the mist. The landlord, Mike Cronin, was waiting outside with his rig. Roosevelt climbed down onto the wooden landing. "Any news?" "Not a word," Cronin spoke awkwardly, uncertain as to how to address his new passenger. "Jump in right away and we'll be off." He fumbled with a lantern. Roosevelt said, "Here, give it to me," and joined him on the driver's seat. The new horses, two big black Morgans, started off swiftly. Cronin was an expert whip and hoped to break his own daylight record of just under 2 hours to North Creek. The horses knew every curve of the 16-mile road, but the descent grew slippery, and one of them stumbled. Conscious of the precious value of his cargo, Cronin dragged on the reins. "Oh, that doesn't matter," Roosevelt explained. "Push ahead." Most of the time, the road was invisible except when the log bridges drummed suddenly under the buckboard's wheels, and an errant boulders loomed out of the mud, necessitating detours. Roosevelt kept holding his watch to the lantern. "Hurry up, go faster." Their speed increased on the steep ascent. Cronin worried aloud about skidding off the bend and falling hundreds of feet into the bogs beneath. But Roosevelt was calm. "If you're not afraid, I'm not." Well, the final dash was dramatic enough to satisfy Roosevelt's love of stagey arrivals. Sun-reddened cliffs disclosed the racing floodwaters of the Hudson River, and Cronin's horses, refreshed by their brief pause, thundered thrillingly over the bridge into town. The noise acted as a drum roll heralding their entrance into the great main street. Voices shouted, "Here he comes." The buckboard flew past darkened house fronts and stoops still bare of the morning milk. Its wheels had hardly come to a rest at the depot when Roosevelt jumped down to discover, if not notables, at least a small crowd of local citizens and the neat, bespectacled figure of his secretary, William Loeb, Jr. A special train stood waiting. The time on the station clock read 22 minutes past 5. Loeb wordlessly handed over John Hay's telegram from Washington. Roosevelt unfolded it. There was a moment of silence, broken by the impatient hissing of the locomotive. He stared at the 8 words in his hand. "The president died at 2:15 this morning." Looking suddenly worn and weary, he pocketed the paper and strode across the wet platform. A private car was ready for him. He darted up the steps, turned, and waved once. Loeb followed him inside. The train began to move before the door swung behind them. That is how Theodore Roosevelt became President of the United States. And it won't be, and it kind of characterizes the nature, what it would be like for him, this new kind of president who is very energetic, who faces challenges ahead of him, and yet unchallenged himself. At 42, I knew I was going to do that. Theodore Roosevelt became the youngest man to ever hold office. He isn't the youngest man ever elected. That would go to John Kennedy in 1961. But John Kennedy was 43. But Theodore Roosevelt was impetuous, energetic, and he had a penchant for what he called the strenuous life of manly adventures. I mean, this is a man who had lived in North Dakota for several years. He was also well known as for engaging in, or he would be well known for being an outdoorsman. He used to vacation, even though he lived at Oyster Bay on Long Island. He would vacation in upstate New York while he was governor and with his children all summer. That was the thing that people did if you had money back in the day. There was no such thing as air conditioning. So what you would do is you would go to your cabin in the north where it was cooler. Theodore Roosevelt would sort of set the standard for 20th century presidents, not to be changed. He would officially and actively engage in domestic and foreign affairs. This is something that presidents normally didn't do. They might do it occasionally, but not at any great pace. Theodore Roosevelt also believed that the president was, quote, the steward of the public welfare, and he moved to set the political agenda. Every president since has in some way tried to do that. I mean, even today, presidents are seen as setting the presidential agenda. From the beginning, Roosevelt would establish his program he called the Square Deal, which attempted to confront the problems caused by economic consolidation. And he did this by distinguishing between good and bad corporations. You're going to see a division here in progressive thought on what we should do with what they called bigness and big corporations. There were those that felt that you needed to break them all up. Roosevelt felt that was unproductive. He said, in his opinion, you couldn't stop bigness, but those that had been good or were good and served the public interest should and could deserve to remain active. But those who didn't serve the public interest, run by greedy financiers and so forth, and only run for profit, they didn't have a right to exist in his mind. So that's where he made the change. The Great Astonishment occurred in early 1902, when early in his administration, he moved to shock the corporate world by announcing his intention to prosecute the Northern Securities Act under the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Northern Securities Company had been created by J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan, and under his leadership, the Northern Securities Company, it owned the stock and directed the affairs of three major Western railroads, which monopolized the transportation between the Great Lakes and the Pacific. So Morgan is completely astonished, and businesses were outraged when Roosevelt moves to do this. And this holding company really was, a monopoly. And eventually what happened was, he actually, went to Roosevelt and said, look, if there was a problem or something, you could have sent the Attorney General, he could have sent your person to my person, and we could have figured this out. And Roosevelt let it be very clear that that's not what was going to happen. That, the days of the corporations completely running and having an advantage were going to be over very quickly. Morgan was even further outraged when, he was actually shocked, that the President of the United States would sink so low as to enforce the law. Imagine that. And by 1904, the Supreme Court actually backed up Roosevelt and ordered the Northern Securities Company to be dissolved. President Roosevelt would also consider himself to be an honest broker in labor disputes, and he felt that the president should be impartial rather than automatically side with employers as many of his predecessors did. Roosevelt took a different tactic, and this started in 1902 when there was a great strike in West Virginia and Pennsylvania. At that time, there was a stalemate in negotiations, so Theodore Roosevelt summoned union and management to the White House, and the management didn't want to come. Management did not want to negotiate, and Roosevelt threatened to take over the mines if they didn't show up, and later submit themselves to arbitration to be settled by a commission, which would be appointed by men of Roosevelt's choosing. And as a result of this, this is where you start to see a big change in presidential politics. In 1904, Roosevelt would be reelected, and people liked the fact that there was more of a direct federal regulation in the economy. I mean, this was something that was new, and it was something that, for the most part, appeared to be a good thing. It was something that would offer a good balance to what was the alternative that had been going on for the previous 20 years. And so he did a lot of things to start continue regulating aspects of the economy. One of the first things that he did was he strengthened the Interstate Commerce Commission, which the Supreme Court had limited to collecting merely economic statistics. He got Congress to give it more power. I'll explain in a minute how he did that. We also see that, journalists like Lincoln Stevens, Ida Tarbell, labor leaders, progressive reformers started to create a lot of support for Theodore Roosevelt's regulatory programs. They see this as a positive step for all people. Now, at the same time, in 1906, Congress passed the Hepburn Act. Now, that's where it gave gave a lot more power to the federal government to regulate railroad businesses. And not only do that, they had the power to examine their books. In other words, railroads could no longer just say, well, we need to raise rates and not give a reason. The ICC said, no, we're going to examine the books and we're going to see, if you really do need to do you really need to raise rates this much? It's a way to kind of set a restraint. It's kind of a surprise. And there are also a couple of other things that happened as a result of this. One of the big things, of course, that came out of this was the Pure Food and Drug Act, which was something that was established during Roosevelt's administration. He actively pushed for this. And what it was to establish an agency that would inspect the quality of products of food and drugs and provide labeling. Now, we kind of take this to our advantage. Today, when you go buy a can of soup, you look at the label, and the label will tell you what's in it. And if the first ingredient isn't tomato, then you probably don't want to buy it. But at the same time, what Pure Food and Drug does is it establishes standards for drugs and prescription drugs in particular. It requires that all drug companies who make claims about their product not only prove that it can work in certain tests that they have to show, but they also have to stand behind their product, which is different than, say, some of the other products that are out there that don't have to do that. Vitamins, other what are called supplemental products, weight loss products that are supposed to help men with weightlifting and bulking up and so forth. They don't have to tell you what the side effects are of these things because, well, number one, they don't necessarily test for it, and number two, if it doesn't work, those people do not have to stand behind that product. If you think about this, happened to a lot of people who took the drug Fen-Phen in the 1990s who were trying to lose weight. And, they made all these claims in their television ads. Go Google them. You can Google some of the old television ads. You can lose weight, you don't have to, and so forth. Well, many people followed the program, but what they didn't tell them was that one of the major ingredients in the program caused heart problems. And as a result, people, who had taken these supplements as required and didn't know the dangers, ended up trying to sue these companies. And, they got a big shock when they sued these companies in court because the companies would say, you took this at your own risk. We don't have to stand behind this product. Yeah. So they were out. They had no recourse. But if it's a drug that's approved by FDA, because it has gone through, it's supposed to have gone through this rigorous process. Now, I'm not saying it's not foolproof. Please, don't, things can happen. That's not what I'm saying. But I feel a lot more comfortable knowing that a product has gone through some kind of rigorous testing and has proven to be effective in what it's supposed to do, and I also know what the side effects are, than taking a drug that doesn't do that, that doesn't say, it gives me no feedback, gives me no recourse. I'm just taking it on good faith. A lot of this was also as a result because a lot of these people who wanted food, oddly enough, it was actually the corporations who wanted Food and Drug Inspection because they wanted to be able to say that they had quality in their product. Because this is the famous period of time when you have a lot of traveling salesmen who are selling these, Lydia Pinkham's Magic Elixir, which, they didn't have to tell you what was in it. It contained the mystery drug X14. Well, X14 was alcohol. And you found that a lot of grandmas who were taking this for their rheumatism or other aches and pains that they claimed would take care of ended up being alcoholics and not even knowing it. Talk about that. Another thing that came out of this too, as a result of this, these are three great examples of how Theodore Roosevelt actively did these things. Presidents didn't do this. And it's the Meat Inspection Act in particular that becomes interesting. Theodore Roosevelt, if you can imagine this, actually could read and often did read a book or two a day. And he read the the Octopus, which really didn't have anything to do with meat inspection. It had more to do with how the meat industry controlled every aspect of production in Chicago. And what happened was, he was eating breakfast. This is the rumor. The rumor was he was eating breakfast when he got to the point where they were talking about what ingredients that people were sweeping up off the floor and putting in his meat. That's not necessarily the time you want to know that. And so what had happened, of course, is, this is where we get standards. That's why when you go into the grocery store today and you buy meat, there's usually a USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture sticker on there that says that it has been inspected by the U.S. Department and met the standards. Now, if it doesn't have that, that doesn't mean the meat's bad. It just means it doesn't have those standards. So that's something to keep in mind, And then, of course, we start to move into another area. And the other area, of course, is John Muir. One of the things that we have to discuss here is John Muir and the influence that he would have with Theodore Roosevelt as well. This is the first time we have a national park, the first national park, of course, that was developed in 1872, which is, of course, Yellowstone National Park. It was there they were preserving the area. And the idea of this was, the idea was not necessarily to preserve anything as far as, the idea wasn't necessarily to preserve for further development. The idea was partly as a result of the idea of Western railroads who wanted to have and get involved in something called tourism. This is a new thing. People can now have things like vacation. This is mostly upper class and maybe some middle class people. But, this is where people could now go on vacation and visit these places. But in the 1890s, John Muir started to organize the Sierra Club to start to preserve forests. And what he was doing is he was trying to preserve forests from uncontrolled logging by timber companies. And it said, of course, this was one thing that was important to John Muir, and later he kind of gets involved in this. John Muir's love of nature was mostly due to his recovery from a past accident that he had gotten when he was in Indianapolis, when he worked in a machine shop. He had found enlightenment, possibly God, through nature after he recovered his sight. And so he, lived the mountain man idea. He called forests God's first temples. And he believed men could experience directly the presence of God in nature. And I assume some people, I'm sure you probably could, but this is where you have in John Muir this blend of sort of this kind of evangelical-like progressivism kind of blend with this sort of romantic idea of nature that's inspired by pre-Civil War writers like Henry David Thoreau, who also lamented the intrusion of civilization on nature. And of course, he develops a large following among urban dwellers. But unlike this, unlike a lot of transcendentalists, he develops this broad following. And a lot of these people who lived in the cities, they came to see nature less as something to conquer and more as a place to recreate, obtain personal growth, walk through the forest and, kind of dwell in nature. Congress would later in the 1890s authorize the president to, quote, withdraw forest reserves from economic development. The idea was to restrict the idea was that this restriction on economic freedom was done in the name of greater good. We were helping preserve reserves for the American government. But Theodore Roosevelt would find another reason for this. Theodore Roosevelt becomes very much a conservationist. And he brings conservation to the national level by making it a federal policy. Theodore Roosevelt, it's no surprise because Theodore Roosevelt had been a dedicated outdoorsman from his entire life up until that point. He lived out on North Dakotas and ranched out there for some time. And he built a ranch himself in the 1880s and moved to preserve parts of the national environment from other parts from exploitation. He's one of the first presidents to actually do that. And so with that, we get the development of a new thing called the National Forest Service. And the first head of this would, of course, be a man named Gifford Pinchot, who would take millions of acres and set aside them for preservation. In the view of many progressive preservationists, the scarcest resources out there needed to be kind of preserved. And so this was this is a really good example of how we start to see this notion of preserving these areas. And three of them in particular became national parks. I mean, you have Yellowstone, Yosemite, Glacier. These were the three major parks that actually are developed out there. I've been to two of them. But at the same time, you also understand there's also another kind of aspect of this, and that the development of some of these parks also required the removal of Native Americans who actually hunted and fished in these areas as well. Alas, another movement off the land. But this is really a typical progressive reform because you've got all the elements that are out there in progressivism. Number one, you've got the aspect of experts being involved in government intervention. The idea that you can have experts that are apart from the political and economic battles that can make decisions for the greater good. Well, it sounds like a good idea, but it rarely did it not become political. Because you can imagine the lumber companies and some of the mining companies were not thrilled that Pinchot withdrawing some of these reserves and withdrawing land specifically to be preserved for the government. And of course, the idea was on Pinchot's side was to prevent special interests from causing irreparable harm to the environment. And the aim, of course, here was less to do with economic utilization for natural resources rather than to develop responsible scientific planning for their use. In other words, yes, we thought that this area was going to be developed, but it was also there to, for lack of a better way to put it, to be more scientific in how to use and preserve them, and also to, even reforest. Pinchot ran into all kinds of problems because he halted timber companies from recklessly assaulting the national forest. They would go in, they would clear cut, and when you clear cut, you not only do you kill the trees, you're killing a lot of the growth around it, and of course this can cause erosion and causes more problems. And so he forced the companies to be more scientific and more considerate in their use. He also believed that, development and conservation could go hand in hand. Mining and grazing on public land can be controlled. It didn't have to be eliminated. And even today, we do have some public grazing on some of these lands. And some of the other things that are good out there as far as development as well. I mean, this is also at this time when we see the withdrawal of Glacier National Park, excuse me, of the preservation of the Grand Canyon. They did this, sort of as a last resort in some ways to prevent developers from possibly building. Can you imagine a bunch of developers building condominiums on the rim of the Grand Canyon? I mean, today it's such a horrifying thought, but 120 years ago it wasn't such a horrifying thought. And again, the notion was to preserve some of these natural resources so everybody could enjoy them. Another conservationist aspect, of course, out there was water conservation. The water resources in the West are always a problem. And you're always going to get kinds of politics and conflict that are involved in such scarce resources. The West really cried out for regulation on water, and governments at all levels had moved to control the power of Western rivers. They would build dams, irrigation projects to regularize the flow of water, to prevent overflows, to prevent waste, provide for larger scale agricultural development, and of course urban development. And so water projects became full of all kinds of political conflicts. One that kind of occurred in the early 20th century was in Los Angeles. The other was, of course, in San Francisco, where as you see these cities in the West increase in size and number, you see also a battle for scarce resources. In Los Angeles, in the Owens Valley, the city of Los Angeles had secretly been buying up large tracts of land east of the city. And what LA started to do was construct a major aqueduct between the 5 years between 1908 and 1913. And this was over the objections of the valley's residents because water was being diverted from the valley. And as a result, what happened was, the farmers in the area did quite well. I mean, they were doing quite well up until the 1920s. Because so much water by that time had been diverted, the valley could no longer even support farming or ranching that it had done before. So it's at the expense of a lot of people that this occurred as well. And so at that point, I think this is where I'm going to leave it, and we're going to come back and we're going to discuss more progressive presidents as time